What if punishment came with a visible label, something you could not hide from the eyes of others? Imagine a lone figure by a campfire, a wanderer clutching his cloak tighter as passers-by avert their gaze, not because he looks like anyone else, but because there is a mark they know and fear. That picture has haunted readers of Genesis for millennia. The text says God set a sign on Cain after he murdered his brother Abel. But what was that sign? A scar? A tattoo? A supernatural glow? A legal guarantee? Or simply a narrative device to move the story forward? To answer whether the mark of Cain is myth, legend, or historical evidence, we need to walk three paths at once. The path of the text itself, what Genesis actually says, and the range of meanings its Hebrew allows. The path of interpretation, how Jewish and Christian traditions across centuries read this brief, odd sentence. And the path of material history, what archaeology and ancient Near Eastern customs can plausibly tell us about marking people. Along the way, we must also face a darker road, how this small line of scripture was later misused to justify prejudice and violence. My aim is not to reveal a single definitive object hiding behind the word sign, but to probe the probabilities and to separate the biblical claim, later traditions, and historical speculation. First, the text. Genesis 4 narrates one of the first great ruptures in the human story. Cain kills Abel. The sequence is compressed and stark. God confronts Cain, pronounces a punishment, a restless, wandering life, and then, in the same breath, pronounces a protection. Therefore, whoever kills Cain shall suffer vengeance sevenfold. To ensure Cain's life is not ended by vengeance, the text says God put a mark, Hebrew ot, on Cain, lest anyone who found him should kill him. That is Genesis in a nutshell: crime, judgment, and a curious measure of mercy that takes the form of an identifying ot. The Hebrew word ot appears in many places in the Bible. It can mean a mark on the body, but it can also signify a sign or token in the wider sense, a thing that points to something else. A rainbow is an ot of God's covenant with Noah. Circumcision is an ot of the covenant with Abraham. The Passover blood on the doorframe is described as an ot. So the lexicon gives us options. Ot sometimes refers to a physical mark, sometimes to a symbolic sign, sometimes to a legal or ritual indicator. The immediate context of Genesis 4 gives us little to decide which sense is intended. The text is laconic. It supplies no physical description, no location on the body, and no mechanism for how the mark works. That deliberate lack of detail is part of the mystery. But the original Hebrew word complicates everything, and that complication opens the door to centuries of interpretation. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible used by Hellenistic Jews, renders ot here with a Greek term that carries the idea of a sign. The Latin Vulgate follows suit, using signum. Later translations into English and other languages mostly use mark or sign. Those choices are not neutral. A translator who renders ot as mark encourages images of a visible stigma, while sign can allow for less corporeal interpretations. Lexicons like Brown Driver Briggs and Halot note the semantic range and urge caution. In short, the Hebrew grammar and the history of translation do not pin the matter down. Now imagine how such a short, ambiguous phrase might be read by readers with different concerns. To some, a visible mark makes sense. If Cain is to be protected from being killed by strangers, a visible sign that says "do not touch" would function well in a world where strangers can exact revenge. That reading treats the ot as a pragmatic device, an external label that conveys social information and prohibits violence. To others, the ot is symbolic. God is placing a divine guarantee or a covenantal token on Cain's life, not necessarily altering his skin or body. Forging the past into visible tokens and seals was common in the ancient world, but the text does not force us to choose between these images. If we move beyond the Hebrew and its translations, we find a vast and varied history of interpretation. Ancient Jewish interpretive traditions, Targumim and Midrashim, offer divergent answers. Some Targumic expansions describe an angel marking Cain with a visible sign. Midrashic literature sometimes elaborates further into physical details, a mark on the forehead or elsewhere, a branding of sorts. Medieval Jewish commentators also proposed a range. Some saw a change in Cain's appearance that made him recognizable. Others emphasized the protective function and spoke of God's promise as the primary element. These traditions should be read as interpretive responses to a laconic biblical line, imaginative attempts to fill a narrative gap, not claims to new revelation. They are precious for understanding how communities read Scripture, but they are not themselves the same as the text. Christian interpreters, from the Fathers through the medieval period, picked up and multiplied these possibilities. The Fathers, think Irenaeus, Augustine, and others, often spiritualized the mark. Some saw it as a sign of God's providence that tempered justice with mercy, a small but dramatic reminder that divine punishment need not be annihilation. Medieval exegesis introduced other images. Depending on culture and available analogies, commentators suggested a visible brand, a signal in the heavens, or even an internal change. The Vulgate's neutral signium allowed allegorical readings as easily as literal ones. Importantly, when later Christian thinkers speculated about outward marks, they sometimes did so under the influence of local customs around branding, scapulars, and other marks of identity, so the interpretive lenses were often cultural. That cultural lens is crucial when we turn to the archaeological and historical record. Do we have evidence that ancient Near Eastern societies routinely marked people in ways resembling the mark of Cain? The short answer is practices of bodily marking, tattoos, scarification, branding, and clothing emblems are attested in a variety of ancient cultures. But the evidence for the Levant in the early second millennium is thin precisely because soft tissue rarely survives. What archaeology can do, however, is provide a context. In the ancient Near East, marks of identity were everywhere. Seals that impressed tokens on clay, amulets that served as protective signs, and iconography that shows figures bearing distinctive items or insignia. Tattooing is visible in Egyptian art and in some mummified remains. Inscriptions and legal texts sometimes mention marks used to identify criminals or slaves. Iconography from Mesopotamia and the Levant depicts ritual marks or signs associated with cultic belonging. These practices show that marking the body or attaching a visible token to a person was not foreign to the ancient mind. Yet this contextual affirmation is not the same as archaeological proof for Cain's mark. There is no physical object, inscription, or residue that can be tied to an individual named Cain. Scripture situates Cain in a mythic early phase of human history, before settled cities and proper archives, and that places him outside the reach of ordinary archaeological verification. When scholars speak of evidence, they mean patterns and analogies. Given what we know about A&E practices, what sorts of marks might people plausibly have used? They argue, tentatively, that a visible sign, whether a scar, a tattoo, or a symbolic amulet worn openly, would have been intelligible to contemporaries as conveying social status or taboo. But such inference is not proof. It is probabilistic reasoning grounded in cultural parallels. We should also notice the literary shape of Genesis. The oat functions inside a tightly woven narrative that contrasts exile and protection. God curses Cain to be a fugitive and a wanderer, a life destabilized and marginalized, yet refuses to allow him to be killed. The mark then accentuates both his vulnerability and his enforced distinction. The narrative uses the oat to make a theological point. Wrongdoing does not always lead to obliteration. Divine justice is complicated by mercy and providential ordering. This theological reading does not exclude a physical manifestation, but it shifts emphasis away from corporeal detail and toward meaning. The mark marks a moral and social consequence. In this sense, the oat is as much about identity, Cain's new status before God and others, as about any dermatological reality. Between the textual ambiguity and the interpretive proliferation lies a landscape that was sadly fertile for abuse. Across history, some interpreters seized upon the idea of a visible bodily stigma and racialized it. At various points in the medieval and early modern periods, and regrettably even later, readers of Scripture used the mark of Cain as a theological cover for prejudices that linked lineage, skin tone, and moral standing. These claims have no basis in the biblical text and represent a misuse of Scripture to justify social hierarchies and violence. It is important to be explicit. These racist appropriations were interpretive distortions, not legitimate exegesis. They should be condemned, studied critically, and corrected. So where does this leave us on the original question? Myth, legend, or historical evidence? The best balanced answer is layered. The narrative of Genesis, as a theological text, presents the mark as a decisive but undefined element in the story of Cain. It functions within the world of mythic origins, a story that explains human behavior, social order, and divine ethics. So, in that literary sense, it belongs to the realm often called myth, not as falsehood, but as primordial storytelling that conveys meaning. Yet, the ought also slots into historical practices. Marking, sealing, and signaling were real and widespread in the ancient Near East, which gives the image plausibility. And finally, when it comes to hard archaeological evidence that a specific physical mark was placed on a historical figure named Cain, there is nothing. No artifact will resolve this textual lacuna. To make these distinctions clear, the biblical claim is literary and theological. The interpretive tradition is varied and imaginative, and the historical evidence is circumstantial and contextual rather than direct. Scholars who study the Hebrew often conclude that the safest scholarly posture is to hold multiple possibilities in tension. The text itself allows a range of meanings, and different traditions emphasize different aspects. Some stress the punitive element, others the protective one. Some imagine physicality, others spiritual sign. Linguists and philologists add nuance. The word ought, as we said, ranges over sign, token, and mark. Its uses in other passages sometimes require tangible objects, a seal, a physical sign, but sometimes point to symbolic actions. The verb forms and syntax in Genesis 4 do not oblige us to imagine a specific bodily transformation. Nor does the surrounding narrative supply corroborating details. No neighbor reports seeing the mark, no physical description is passed down to later generations within the story. That silence, again, is significant. It suggests the author did not intend a forensic description, but rather left space for the mark's function in the moral economy of the tale. Turning back to tradition, the Targumim and Midrashim help us see how communities lived with the ambiguity. Midrash often supplies narrative fillers for lacuna, which is precisely what the descendants of biblical readers needed, an image that helps them imagine the consequences of transgression. Patristic writers frequently read the mark allegorically, sometimes as a symbol of God's restraining grace, sometimes as an emblem of the consequences of sin that marks a person socially. Medieval glossators, living in societies that used visible emblems of status and punishment, sometimes slipped into literalizing what may have been primarily metaphorical. This trajectory warns us about an interpretive hazard. Later contexts shape how earlier texts are read. Archaeology and comparative anthropology cannot rescue the story from its textual modesty, but they enrich our understanding. Evidence of tattoos in Egypt and Nubia, iconographic hints of scarification, and legal records mentioning branded slaves tell us ancient societies did mark bodies. Amulets and seals, too, functioned as wearable signs attesting to identity or protection. A practical, protective sign on a person traveling alone could have been something like an amulet hung visibly on the neck, or perhaps a specific garment or token that allowed others to recognize divine protection. In many cultures, clothing and accessories can be as much a mark as ink or scar. We must therefore resist image-specific claims and broaden our imagination to include material culture as a likely means by which a sign could be enacted. We also need to attend to the social dynamics of marking. A visible sign does social work. It alters how others treat you. Imagine walking into a market with a badge that reads "Protected." People might avoid you out of fear, respect, or taboo. That is what Genesis seems to suggest. The mark both isolates Cain and secures his life. Marking can stigmatize. It can also preserve. That paradox is theologically rich. It forces readers to ask what justice looks like when punishment and protection cohabit the same ordinance. Is the mark compassion disguised as shame? Is it a way to keep order in a fragile community where vengeance could spiral? Genesis leaves us with the tension, and the tension is likely intentional. Now, let's be precise about misuse. Throughout history, some commentators and social actors pressed the mark into service as a justificatory myth for racial or social discrimination, most notoriously in justifications for enslaving or oppressing particular groups. These readings typically added elements not present in the text: bodily darkening, hereditary stigma, or immutable inferiority. Those readings are exegetically irresponsible and morally reprehensible. They violate basic hermeneutical principles, most obviously not reading a text against its plain sense or reading later socio-political concerns back into ancient narrative. Whenever the mark of Cain has been used to legitimate exclusion or violence, it reflects the interpreter's ideology more than the Bible's message. Recognizing that abuse is part of the historical story is important precisely because it teaches us caution. A short, enigmatic biblical line can be weaponized if not handled carefully. So how should modern readers, especially those within the faith communities that hold Genesis as sacred, approach this text? First, with humility about the limits of our knowledge. The Bible does not give a forensic description. It gives theological significance. Second, with historical awareness. The text sits in a world where marks were meaningful, so reading the otot as culturally intelligible is reasonable. Third, with ethical vigilance. We must refuse any interpretation that reifies the text into an instrument for dehumanizing others. Fourth, with exegetical care. Distinguish text, tradition, and speculation. Say, the text says, tradition holds, or some scholars propose, rather than conflating these registers. Practically, the mark invites reflection on the nature of consequence and mercy. Cain's life is not ended by his crime, but neither is he restored to his former place. The mark symbolizes a new identity, one shaped by wrongdoing and divine restraint. It can teach readers about how communities manage offenders, the balance of punishment to deter and protection to prevent cycles of bloodshed. Theologically, it gestures to a God who is at once judge and sustainer, who preserves life even when that life is marked by wrongdoing. This is a sobering and unsettling image, divine justice that refuses simple retribution, divine mercy that does not erase the moral consequences of action. What about the title question again? Myth, legend, or historical evidence? Calling the mark a myth is accurate only if by myth we mean a primordial narrative that communicates theological truths rather than a documented historical event. That is a fair label for the genre of Genesis. Calling it legend fits insofar as later traditions expanded and dramatized the brief biblical mention into fuller stories. Calling it historical evidence would be misleading. There is no archaeological signature or contemporary inscription that confirms a physical mark on a historical Cain. What we do have is cultural plausibility. Marking as a practice existed. Signs and tokens functioned in the ancient world. The concept makes social sense. But plausibility is not evidence. Our responsible conclusion is therefore layered. The mark is a narrative and theological element embedded in a culture familiar with marks. Later traditions made it concrete in multiple ways, but no material evidence anchors it to a specific bodily feature on a historical person. Before concluding, it is worth reminding ourselves how careful reading matters for both scholarship and ethical living. When the Bible speaks in compressed, symbolic language, our impulse may be to fill the gaps with colorful details. That impulse is not wrong in itself. Storytellers across time have done the same, but we must always track what belongs to the text, what belongs to centuries of interpretation, and what belongs to modern imagination. Doing so preserves the integrity of the text and prevents its weaponization. In closing, consider Cain once more by the fire, marked, wandering, a human carrying the weight of his act and the odd mercy of divine protection. The image resists easy categorization. It refuses to be simply a forensic detail for anthropologists or a symbol for polemicists. It is a narrative hinge, a small word, ut, on which human questions about guilt, punishment, identity, and mercy swing. If you stand with the ancient readers, you will notice how the ambiguity itself presses you into reflection. What would you do if you saw someone marked and ostracized? Would you enact vengeance, or would you turn away? Or would you shelter the marked? Genesis summons readers to decide. If you want the full deep dive into ancient translations, medieval interpretations, and the latest archaeological scholarship, breakdowns of Greek and Latin renderings, excerpts from Targumic expansions, and what lexicons like BDB and Hallowed actually say, like and subscribe and stay with the video. There is much more nuance to unpack, and we will walk through sample passages from the Septuagint and medieval glosses in the next segment. To summarize our journey, the mark of Cain is best understood as a theologically charged element in a primordial narrative. Ancient and medieval traditions supplied vivid and varied pictures of it, drawing on their cultural vocabularies. Archaeology confirms that marking practices were known in the ancient world, but provides no direct proof for a specific mark on Cain. And historical misuse of the idea, especially for racist ends, represents a grave moral distortion that must be repudiated. The story thus rests between mythic meaning and cultural plausibility, not between factual evidence and modern forensic certainty. If this topic interested you, tell us below which interpretation you find most persuasive. Do you lean toward a physical mark, a symbolic sign, or a legal token? Were you surprised by how later readers treated the phrase? Share your thoughts. And if you want to follow up, watch our related episode on How Ancient Judaism Read Genesis, where we trace interpretive patterns across the Targumim and Midrashim.